vocally at street corners, correct? Okay, why don't we do that today?
Well, I think it's because we'd have better ways of delivering the news.
I mean, I think you get my point. Like today, at one point in time, there was very limited access to news, and there was an appropriate time where potentially we needed to have state-sponsored news. But is that the way? Do we need that today?
No, we do not. And may I quote Thomas Jefferson on this very point? Since you bring this up? He said, "To compel a man to furnish contributions of money for the propagation of opinions which he disbelieves and abhors is sinful and tyrannical." This is what I base my opposition to public funding for media.
Yeah, and that's why I think that given this context, like let's be real. It was said that we're attacking free speech. This is state-sponsored speech, and the very reason why we have these witnesses before us today isn't because they're totally being funded or completely being funded. We're not bringing in Disney Channel in here, right? We're not bringing in the National Geographic, right, for their content. The reason why we're having this conversation is because we are funding you, and because we're funding you, the taxpayers get to have an opportunity to ask, why are we funding some of this content that they might disagree with? Right?
Yeah, no, that's completely right. In fact, I think that PBS and NPR, but especially PBS, will thrive on the membership model. They keep saying it's such a small percentage. Well, if it's the public funding, if it's such a small percentage, then no problem.
Yeah. So, Ms. Maurer, I'm going to ask a very difficult question, but if you're in my shoes and you have to face the fact, can we fund Social Security or do we spend money on NPR? Which would you choose?
Congressman, I would argue that
if you had to pick, if you were forced to make a decision, there wasn't enough money to go around, Social Security or NPR?
We know how important public media is to our nation's seniors, sir.
More important than Social Security. I think the American people would disagree.
I think that
Ms. Kerger, let me ask this. Would it be more appropriate to fund PBS or to fund veterans' health care? If given limited resources, which is where we're at.
I recognize the limited resources, and I feel that both are important for this country.
And I think what the American people want to know is when they're sending money, their taxpayer dollars, and they're funding things like Independent Lens. And look, I like some of the content on your stations. I love Nova. But you know what? Nova competes with National Geographic and Nature. Why are we funding something that competes with these private sector interviews? I like Sesame Street, but I also know that it's competing directly with Handy Manny, Doc McStuffins, and Little Einsteins, right? Those exist, and we're not funding them. They're not here having to defend their content. But because we are funding it, I'm going to ask you, why are we funding episodes of Real Lens, Independent Lens, about an episode called Real Boy, a trans teen navigates adolescent sobriety and physical emotional ramifications? That's what the American people want to know. Social Security.
We're out of time, but our witnesses can answer the questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. That was a documentary that was produced for adults as part of our primetime audience, and it was part of a point of view that we share to try to help people understand the wide breadth of experiences of people across the country.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
I now recognize the gentlewoman from the District of Columbia, Ms. Norton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to thank the witnesses for being here today. I am a strong supporter of public broadcasting, and I am a regular listener and watcher of the public broadcasting stations here in D.C. Public broadcasting is a public good. WETA's DC's local PBS station is proudly home to the world's longest running high school quiz show. For over 60 years, the show, It's Academic, has showcased some of the best and brightest high school students in the Capital Region. President Reagan once praised It's Academic as quote, a reminder of the importance of education, end quote. And even Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas made a guest appearance. One area student who competed on the show said, quote, it's made me a lot smarter, end quote. And, quote, getting to say that I've been on a TV show is really cool, end quote. Its academic is just one example of local public media programming that celebrates and lifts up the community. Mr. Ullman, in your experience as head of the Alaska Public Media, why is it important for public media to elevate local voices?
Thank you so much for that question. There are stories to be told all over this great nation of ours. And one of the things that I take the utmost pride in is being someone who can provide the strategy and build the resources and build the capacity to ensure that we can capture video about those uniquely Alaskan stories. We can capture audio about those uniquely Alaskan stories. And what we do is we take that opportunity to not only tell those stories for ourselves within our great state, but we also work with our national partners. This local national partnership is essential. Without PBS, without NPR, you wouldn't hear stories, news stories, public affairs stories, community stories from Alaska. You wouldn't see them on the PBS NewsHour. This is vital. It's vital for Alaskans to know that they're connected to their nation and that what we do in Alaska matters to our nation. Thank you again for that question.
Ms. Kruger, I would love to hear your bigger picture taker on this. If PBS stations are suddenly taken off the air, what would be lost to communities across the country?
I've spent a good part of my time as the president of PBS traveling and visiting our stations across the country because I feel for me to do my job well, I need to understand what the role of our stations are in communities. That means spending time not just with station management, but also with people in the community. So I've been to all 50 states. And the reason that we are here and the reason that we are arguing so passionately for funding, recognizing there are very difficult challenges in our country right now, is that many of our smaller and actually medium-sized stations would not exist without the federal appropriation. And when you look at a station like Cookeville, Tennessee, which serves part of Appalachia, 50% of their budget comes from the federal government. Those are stations that I've seen that have small staffs that do extraordinary work. And those are the stations that I worry would not survive. This would be an existential moment for them. And that's why I think this is so important.
The D.C. area NPR station similarly provides acclaimed programming, including up-to-the-minute news and local shows exploring the D.C. cultural scene and sharing stories from all over the city, including historically marginalized areas. The station also produces award-winning journalism, such as an investigative feature on local families coping with sickle cell disease. Throughout the country, more and more local news outlets are closing each day at a rate of more than 2 per week. This has made public radio reporting all the more important. Ms. Maher, why is it beneficial for journalists to live in the communities they cover?
Yeah. We'll let the witness quickly answer, and then we're out of time.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. We find that enabling public radio to continue to be funded allows for us to meet the needs of people who live in news deserts. And having journalists who are from that community means they can prioritize the needs of that community, whether it's sickle cell issues in DC or whether it's the price of sorghum in our agricultural heartland, whether it is thinking about the wildfires that we see across the center and west of our country, or whether it is the impact of storms across the Gulf and southern parts of our country. We recognize local journalists. They speak the language. They recognize the pronunciations of the places that they come from. They come from the community. It is tremendous value to enable that we are for America, from Americans, and all American voices are heard.
The gentlelady's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Fallon, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Marr, do you believe that National Public Radio takes a balanced and fair approach to news, politics, culture, et cetera?
Mr. Fallon, thank you for the question. I came into National Public Radio with
And I apologize. It's just that we have such limited time. Do you
Of course.
believe that to be true?
I believe that we have work to do. We always do in order to improve
think
and
it's
serve
more-
all Americans.
More accurate than not that you're fair, or you're either fair or you're unfair. So what do you think you are?
I believe we wake up every day with a desire to be fair, and it is part of
You're
why
not claiming that you're fair. You have a desire to be fair. Okay. So you would not describe NPR as objective and nonpartisan?
I would.
You would, okay. Ms. Karger, same question for you. Would you believe the PBS is fair and objective and nonpartisan?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the quick answer, too. So I found it interesting that the CBP's recent goal was to promote efforts that ensure fact-based journalism that promotes a symphony of ideological viewpoints. You both agree with that goal?
Yes.
All right, wonderful. So, Ms. Karger, in 2023, when PBS had a program, Washington Week with the Atlantic, and when President Biden's mental acuity was questioned, one of the reporters claimed the GOP was lying. Another reporter, Jeffrey Goldberg, who's been in the news of late, described Biden as, quote, mentally acute. Were you aware if there were any dissenting opinions on that program that day?
I don't know from that day, no.
There were not. But fortunately, there was a debate in, I believe, June of 2024, where the American people and the world found out just who was lying. The Democrats, Jeffrey Goldberg, and PBS. Ms. Marr, I'm sure you're aware that Hunter Biden had a laptop.
I am, sir, yes.
Okay. And there were many stories written about said laptop.
Yes, sir.
And in 2020, unfortunately, NPR's managing editor for news refused to cover the story, and he branded it a, quote, waste of time, not a real story, and a distraction. And instead, unfortunately, of NPR investigating, they ran a puff piece that led with, experts say attack on Hunter Biden addiction deepens stigma for millions. It's unfortunate that NPR ignored the Hunter Biden laptop story, but y'all did talk quite a bit about the debunked Russia collusion. Do you know how many times NPR interviewed Adam Schiff about
Congressman,
collusion?
I would love to say that we actually believe we made a mistake on the Hunter Biden laptop story.
And I appreciate that. Thank you. How many times did y'all interview Adam Schiff about the Russia collusion?
I'm sorry, I don't have that number.
It was 25 times. You know how many times NPR interviewed Chairman of this committee, Oversight Committee, Jamie Comer, about the Biden impeachment inquiry for the Hunter Biden tax evasion and illicit business dealings of the Biden family?
I'm sorry, I don't know.
I believe that's 0, so it's 25-0. Ms. Karger, you're aware there's a political spectrum. It goes all the way from the far right to the far left and everywhere in between. Would it trouble you to hear that for 6 months there was an analysis done on PBS's NewsHour from June to November of 2023 where they found that far right that term was used 162 times and far left was only used 6 times? Do you find that troubling?
I don't know the study that you're referring to, and I'd be very interested in seeing it and understanding how they came up with those numbers.
Media Research Center did a 6-month analysis, and it's not how do you find it. You either say far right or it's terms. Yeah. They use the term far right 162 times, far left 6 times. That's a 96 to 4% skew. You're also aware that you covered the GOP and Democratic national conventions in 2024?
Yes, we did.
Okay. Interestingly, 72% of the coverage of the GOP convention was negative, 88% of the Democratic convention was positive. Shouldn't be surprising when you have anchors like Amna Nowat, who described the Republican rhetoric as, quote, outright racism, and, quote, echoing white supremacy. Ms. Mayor, NPR, you believe your reporters are fair? You said they're fair and they're working at it.
I believe that they work
And
to be every day, sir.
They're non-biased. And yet, you have the voter registration issue. I mean, we're all human beings. We're all going to see through the world through a certain lens. And are you aware of any Republicans, any registered Republicans in your newsroom?
I couldn't say registered, but I know we have conservatives in our newsroom, yes.
Okay, so the recent registration, when it was looked at, 87 Democrats and 0 Republicans registered.
I found that very concerning,
Yeah,
sir.
I would. Not even 40 to 30 or 50 to 20, 87 to 0. But it shouldn't be surprising when their own CEO says things like, I'm so done with late-stage capitalism, or calls the President of the United States a deranged racist sociopath, or that America's addicted to white supremacy. So billions have gone into both of your coffers over the last several decades. And I understand why Democrats on this committee are going to viciously and vehemently defend you all, because you become a propaganda wing of the Democratic Party. 67% of your viewers and listeners identify as Democrat, with only 12% conservative, and you become a sandbox for leftist propagandists to frolic on taxpayer dime and no more. And when you said in the beginning you're going to promote a symphony of ideological viewpoints, yeah, you do. If you're left-leaning, far left,
The gentleman's
or
time has
remarkably
expired.
Marxist, I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Fallon. I now recognize a gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gill.
Thank you, Chairwoman Greene, and I apologize, I'm getting over a cold, so I'm losing my voice here. Ms. Marr, I want to start with you. Just generally, would you say you generally agree or disagree with the following statement? The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles?
I would not say I agree with that, sir.
You're not. That's good to hear. It's interesting because a lot of your thinking, as expressed by your public statements, is deeply infused with economic and cultural Marxism. Do you believe that America is addicted to white supremacy?
I believe that I tweeted that, and as I've said earlier, I believe much of my thinking has evolved over the last half decade.
It has evolved. Why did you tweet that?
I don't recall the exact context, sir, so I wouldn't be able to say.
Okay. Do you believe that America believes in black plunder and white democracy?
I don't believe that, sir.
You
Don't know where
tweeted
statement
that in
comes from.
reference to a book you were reading at the time, apparently, The Case for Reparations.
I don't think I've ever read that book, sir.
You tweeted about it. You said you took a day off to fully read The Case for Reparations. You put that on Twitter in January of 2020.
Apologies, I don't recall that I did.
Okay.
I no doubt that your tweet there is correct, but I don't recall that.
Okay. Do you believe that white people inherently feel superior to other races?
I do not.
You don't? You tweeted something to that effect. You said, I grew up feeling superior. Ha, how white of me. Why did you tweet that?
I think I was probably reflecting on what it was to grow up in an environment where I had lots of advantages.
It sounds like you're saying that white people feel superior.
I don't believe that anybody feels that way, sir. I was just reflecting on my own experiences.
Do you think that white people should pay reparations?
I have never said that, sir.
Yes, you did. You said it in January of 2020. You tweeted, yes, the North, yes, all of us, yes, America, yes, our original collective sin and unpaid debt, yes, reparations, yes, on this day.
I don't believe that was a reference to fiscal reparations, sir.
What kind of reparations was it a reference to?
I think it was just a reference to the idea that we all owe much to the people who came before us.
That's a bizarre way to frame what you tweeted. Okay, how much reparations have you personally paid?
Sir, I don't believe that I've ever paid reparations.
Okay, it's just for everybody else.
I'm not asking anyone
Seems
to pay
to be what you're
reparations, sir.
suggesting. Do you believe that looting is morally wrong?
I believe that looting is illegal, and I refer to it as counterproductive. I think it should be prosecuted.
Do you believe
to the
it's
full extent of the
morally
law.
wrong, though?
Of course.
Of course. Then why did you refer to it as counterproductive? It's a very different way to describe it.
It is both morally wrong and counterproductive, as well as being
You
illegal.
tweeted, it's hard to be mad about protests in reference to the BLM protests, not prioritizing the private property of a system of oppression. You didn't condemn the looting. You said that it was counterproductive. NPR also promoted a book called In Defense of Looting. Do you think that that's an appropriate use of taxpayer dollars?
I'm unfamiliar with that book, sir, and I don't believe that was at my
You
time at
tweeted
NPR.
that you read that book, but
I don't believe that I did read that book, sir.
do you think that a few years ago NPR educated America about, quote, the whole community of genderqueer dinosaur enthusiasts. Do you think that that's an appropriate use of tax dollars?
I was not at NPR at the time, sir.
That's not the question, though. Do you think that that's an appropriate use of our tax dollars?
I think our tax dollars that we use are to be able to provide a wide range of perspectives.
I'll take that as a yes. You do believe that that's appropriate. Your health advisor at NPR also stated in an interview that, quote, fear of fatness is more harmful than actual fat. Would you like to explain how fear of fatness is more harmful than actual fat? That's an editorial at NPR.
I am not familiar with the editorial, and I don't believe that was published during my time here.
It's called Diet Culture is Everywhere. Here's how to fight it. Do you think that that's an appropriate use of taxpayer dollars?
I think any reporting on health is an appropriate use of taxpayer dollars, yes.
And you think that editorializing that fat is not unhealthy is appropriate?
I don't know what that article is, sir, and I'm not familiar with it, so I couldn't
This
say.
is fake news. Do you think that basic accommodations like doorways or seat belts represent, quote, latent fat phobia?
I don't have an opinion.
It's also from NPR. Do you think civility is racist?
No, sir.
No. Your outlet ran an article entitled, quote, when civility is used as a cudgel against people of color. That was on All Things Considered. Would you like to explain?
I'm not on the editorial side, sir. I'm not familiar with that story.
You talk about how NPR is news. This is editorialization, and I'll read it. For many people of color in the United States, civility isn't so much social lubricant as it is a vehicle for containing them, preventing social mobility, and preserving the status quo. This is garbage. I'll spend all of my time doing everything I can to ensure you guys never get another dollar of taxpayer funding. This is complete garbage. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Gill. I now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Jack, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'd like to just start and build off of something Mr. Fallon noted. And Ms. Mayor, I think you noted, and just to confirm within your statement to him, that NPR failed to accurately report the circumstances around and content within Hunter Biden's laptop story. Is that fair to categorize your statement?
Our current editorial leadership believes that we made a mistake not reporting the story and more reporting it earlier, yes.
And I recognize you weren't there at the time, but what institutes and control, what have you done to ensure that never happens again?
A number of things, sir, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to them. We have hired an additional editor core, which we refer to as our editorial review, to make sure that all stories before they go out are comprehensive and well-reviewed. We've instituted a monthly review to ensure that the most challenging stories of every month, we go back and we look at what we may have missed in order to not miss issues again and change processes and policies to be able to have more robust conversation and to ensure all areas and all views are considered. We have hired analysts to be able to count the number of stories that we're running on any particular issue, including whose voices are represented. We've moved from bringing pundits on air to trying to bring direct policymakers on air so that we can ask questions of policymakers rather than hearing through other people's perspectives. Those are just a few of the things we've done so far. I've got a couple others if you have time.
Thank you, and you can submit those for the record. Would you suggest then that the failure to accurately report those circumstances and the content around that story, would you suggest today, as I feel and many others feel, that impacted the 2020 election?
I could not say, sir. I don't know.
Well, I ask because you have a broad viewership, broad listenership, and I'm just curious if it is so broad and it is so necessary for us to continue to give taxpayer funds, as you all submit, to me, to misaccurately report something that's incredibly important around a 2020 election is very concerning. So welcome another thought from you there.
I believe that we made a mistake, as I said, and I believe that we have taken that to heart and are focused on how do we report and report effectively and in a timely fashion on all the issues that matter to all Americans. I hear your concern, sir, and I want you to know that we are truly working on this.
I'd like to spend the rest of my time talking about funding, and I know that some of my colleagues talked about it a little bit today, but could you walk us through the amount of money that NPR receives from CPB annually?
Yes, sure, sir. We receive $11.2 million this past year.
So that we're clear.
The majority of which goes to the public radio satellite system, which we operate on behalf of the entire public radio network. We also received a smaller amount of funding.
One of the first
in
things that
course of the
happened when
past
I
year
was
that went to
confirmed
help
as
us
CIA director.
hire those additional editors and analysts in order to be able to beef up that editorial review. We received funding to support the coverage of the recent election in order to make sure that we had our journalists all across the country and were able to speak to Americans of all different political backgrounds.
And what percentage of your budget share comes from the federal government?
Depending on how you count it, sir, it's less than 5%.
And to help me understand too, the CPB, you know, as I understand it, Congress has appropriated $500 million to the CPB. It flows out, and I think smaller radio stations go and apply for grants for it. Do you receive payment from smaller radio stations through licensing agreements and things of that nature?
We do, and the fees for that are designed around the amount of funding that they get from private member donations. So the fees are not designed around federal funding. They're designed around what sort of direct private support and donations they receive from members and listeners.
Well, I noted Mr. Jordan today suggested that you all are fundraising off this hearing today, and a question that I have then, if you receive less than 5%, and over today you've said that private funding helps support the mission and the work of NPR, could NPR survive without the 5% that we give NPR annually?
My belief is that the funding is essential to the public radio system, and that is the 246 member stations, but the 1,300 stations across the nation, so that we're able, as a network, to serve all Americans with 100% coverage. If federal funding for our network goes away, it means that people in rural parts of America, places where they can't afford to make private donations to support their local journalism, those will be harmed. But, sir, if I may, the bigger harm as well, or the additional harm, is that Americans in places that are affluent or do have many media choices will not be able to hear from their fellow Americans that are often underheard.
Bottom line, if the 5% went away, would NPR still exist?
Well, it would be incredibly damaging to the national public radio system.
I yield back.
Just want to submit to the record.
Turn your microphone on.
Madam Chair, I'd just like to submit to the record this
You asked
flash
unanimous
drive.
consent.
I ask unanimous consent to submit to the record this flash drive containing 6 feet worth of documents documenting NPR and PBS's political bias.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you.
In closing, I want to thank our witnesses once again for their testimony today. I now yield to the Ranking Member Lynch for his closing remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for having this hearing. I want to thank the witnesses for your willingness to testify. In closing, I want to follow up on Mr. Connor's point. I'd point out to my colleagues that there are some government functions that are not merely transactions. There are some undertakings that we, as a country, engage in which are not necessarily justified by cash on the barrel at the point of purchase. Everything is not a transaction. It's not like selling a car, although that's exactly what the President was doing on the lawn of the White House the other day. Sometimes a government program is a long-term investment. I think that applies to public broadcasting. Like when you use public television to teach kids their numbers and their alphabet, because in some households that might be the only source of instruction available. More often, it could be an exercise in trust, because a lot of our parents out there, 88% of parents said they trusted PBS Kids. Or when you have a documentary given by a historian like Ken Burns, and he does research and drills down on the letters and firsthand correspondence of Civil War veterans and families north and south, and gives us the hard facts of the Civil War. Hopefully, we are teaching, or at least reminding people of the wrongfulness of slavery and the consequences of us from a system of bondage and the horrific price that was paid and perhaps is still being paid. Everything is not a transaction. But I do believe that some people see it that way. I think President Trump and Elon Musk see life often as a series of transactions. Much of the support we provide to seniors is not a profitable transaction because they're older and vulnerable. But they have paid for their fair share into Social Security. That's why FDR designed it that way. Some people just wanted the government to promise to pay a pension, but FDR knew that if he had Americans pay into that system, that their sense of fairness would cause them to defend that pension. And so they would fight like hell to get what they had coming. It sounds like we might have to test that theory if Elon Musk and Howard Lutnick have their way. Another thing we do that is not necessarily profitable in a financial sense is that we care for our veterans. It's a promise we made to our sons and daughters in uniform, and it's the right thing to do. And veterans care and veteran benefits are special because those benefits are owed to every veteran who lies in a hospital bed in every VA hospital across the country, because those benefits are for courageous service previously and honorably rendered to our country. And so now it's the time for America and Congress to fulfill their obligation as promised. That's not a transaction. But because of that cost, the Trump administration VA has announced 80,000 layoffs at the VA. Trump and Vance also see support for Ukraine as a transaction, even though they've been invaded by Russia and are fighting for their lives and their freedom. As we saw a couple of weeks ago, for President Trump and Mr. Vance, it was a power transaction. And as the president insisted, Zelensky had no cards to play. And as Vance pointed out, he refused to sufficiently bend the knee, and he didn't dress up. These examples point out the nature of the presidency. Throughout our history, the president has never been viewed as the huckster-in-chief. Instead, our most successful presidents have occupied a position of what could be seen as moral leadership, which might cause some to conclude that America is bankrupt right now. But I have hope in the genius of our Constitution, that the checks and balances of our government framework might once again compensate for that shortcoming in the White House. It could be that Congress might provide that balance, or it may be the judicial branch that steps into the breach, or it might require the ultimate source of power in our system, the people themselves, to demand that we fulfill our obligations to all those most vulnerable in our country, wounded veterans, seniors, children, and the poor, to whom so much is owed. Madam Chair, I appreciate the opportunity here to address this issue. I would have preferred that we were talking about the security breach that occurred recently, but perhaps that will be for another day. But I thank you for your courtesy, and I yield back.
I now recognize myself for closing remarks. The United States is $36 trillion in debt. In fiscal year 2024, the government spent over $1.8 trillion more than it took in. And in fiscal year 2025, the interest on our debt is expected to exceed $1 trillion. As we continue investigating waste, fraud, and abuse, and we can look no further than the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the LGBTQ indoctrination of our children, the systematic racism narrative, and the support for censorship being pushed by the heads of NPR and PBS are just several of the many abuses of taxpayer dollars. And if you are one of the select few who might support such content, you can personally support and fund it with your own money through private donations, because the reality is the United States of America is broke and can't afford it. And after all, PBS and NPR are already fundraising off of this committee hearing. The American people are closely following along today in this long-awaited hearing to hear the case for why Americans' hard-earned tax dollars should continue for public broadcasting. I think from what we have heard here today, the American people will not continue to allow such propaganda to be funded through the federal government with their hard-earned tax dollars. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting that we give over $500 million to no longer serves the public. It serves a narrow audience of wealthy, liberal elites who are out of touch with everyday Americans. Not only have the times changed and the American people who once needed these outlets can now access the news anywhere at any time, but the content that is being put out through these state-sponsored outlets is so radical It is brainwashing the American people and, more significantly, American children with un-American, anti-family, pro-crime fake news. The American people do not support their taxpayer dollars going to NPR articles like, "How is sex determined? Scientists say it's complicated," which discusses how biological sex is not limited to male or female. Or another article about how stories on crime are rife with misinformation and racism. Or about how birds and trees are racist. Over a 7-month period, the Media Research Center discovered the PBS NewsHour gave over 90% of the airtime to the left on gender ideology stories, 90%. As mentioned earlier, PBS was the outlet that featured the child predator drag queen on the education show for kids ages 3 to 8 years old. And to clarify the record, because our witness, Ms. Kerger, lied under oath and said it wasn't featured on PBS, this show was aired on PBS on April 1st, 2021, and we will take a look at this video right now. We're using a TV today because our audio system is having problems. Let's go ahead and watch this video.
So, get your singing voices ready. And we're going to start with our hips. The hips on the drag queen go swish, 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 swish. The shoulders on the drag queen go shimmy, 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 shimmy. Shimmy, 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 blah, 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 blah. The mouth on the drag queen goes blah, 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 all through the town. So, get your singing voices.
The hips go swish, swish, swish. The shoulders go shimmy, shimmy, shimmy. That's repulsive. That's not what children ages 3 to 8 should ever be watching. A grown biological man posing as a woman. And by the way, Ms. Kerger, that was aired on April 1st, 2021. And then something happened. It wasn't an accident. And it wasn't just for a brief time that it was up. It was aired April 1st. And then somehow it expired May 24th. Later on, it was taken down. I wonder why. Wonder why that was taken down. Another egregious example includes back in 2010, PBS's Travis Smiley stated that Christians blow up people every single day. Haven't seen that ever happen in my life. And today, if you look on NPR's website, there is still zero mention of any negative coverage of any Democrat today. And trust us, there are more than plenty of examples to pull from. How about a member from this committee making fun of the governor of Texas for having a disability and living his life in a wheelchair, Ms. Marr? From headlines to podcasts to documentaries to children's programming, NPR and PBS have all but abandoned their promise to deliver unbiased, nonpartisan, and fact-based reporting. The American people have woken up to this nonsense and blatant disregard for truth, and truth matters. And they will not put up with it any longer. Contrary to the beliefs of the head of NPR, Ms. Marr, truth is not subjective. It's actually very important. And there are not multiple truths. There's just one. For a civilization to exist, objective truth must exist. It must be embraced. It must be protected. It is not a distraction, and despite many attempts to whitewash it, truth will prevail. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting is using taxpayer dollars to actively suppress the truth, suppress diverse viewpoints, and produce some of the most outlandish, ludicrous content. After listening to what we've heard today, we will be calling for the complete and total defund and dismantling of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Here's how it works in America every single day, private businesses operate on their own without government funding. We believe that you all can hate us on your own dime. With that and without objection, all members have 5 legislative days within which to submit materials and additional written questions for witnesses, which will be forwarded to the witnesses. If there is no further business without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.